The practice of law in central Illinois was very different in the 19th century than it is today. The courtrooms were much less formal. You would find spittoons in the courtroom. If you spat in a courtroom today, you'd probably get contempt of court. But not only that, the courtroom was a place of entertainment. This is a time where there's no television, there's no movies, there's no internet, there's no smartphones. And if you wanted entertainment, what would you do? Well, when the judge and the lawyers ride into town, you would go to the courthouse and you would watch the cases.
Lawyers would be on display like baked goods, up for tasting. People would walk up and down the long tables and choose an attorney.
Oh, it was a great event. It was almost like a week of festivity. Courts was a big entertainment in those days.
People came in from the countryside when they knew court was going to be in session. The outside on the lawn attracted a lot of excitement, and so there would be magicians out there, and there were musicians who were playing.
And the galleries would be packed with people waiting to see their favorite lawyers come through and argue a case, among whom were Stephen Douglas and the tall, laconic, but very amusing Abraham Lincoln.
The main challenge for attorneys at that time was travel. The state of Illinois is broken down into circuits. So each circuit in Lincoln's time comprised anywhere from 5 to 15 counties. And then so that circuit was basically where the legal cases took place.
So Lincoln did something called riding circuit. He would ride around the 8th Judicial Circuit in central Illinois taking cases. And basically a lot of lawyers would get on their horses and ride around from town to town, county to county, and a judge would go with them.
There were almost impassable roads, very ill-defined, that ran through the prairies of central Illinois. Prairie grasses grew quite tall. They could be taller than a man standing on the ground, or they could reach the height of a man on horseback. So it was very hard to navigate the prairie grasses to go from one county seat to the next county seat.
They didn't have Super 8s or Hampton Inns or things like that, so basically they would stay in taverns, which doubled as hotels. David Davis, who was the judge of the 8th Circuit, he wrote many letters to his wife explaining what life was like traveling, and he was constantly talking about being eaten by mosquitoes and bed bugs and how the food was horrible.
Often they had to share two to a bed, some sleeping on the floor. Davis mentions in one letter he is elated because he got a straw bed. Mount Pulaski was perhaps the tavern that everybody feared the most, and he described it as a place that was filthy, dirty, and the eating terrible. The only person who didn't seem to mind them was Abraham Lincoln. When he was in the courtroom, he knew when to question and when to back off. He knew when to use humor and when it was not appropriate to use humor. And he also was wonderful at understanding the argument of his opponent. And so he would say something like, my opponent has a good argument for this point, and also a very well-reasoned argument on that point. But of course, he's setting it up then so he could pick it apart, and he was a great success at that.
In these sort of moments, you can see how Lincoln is gaining the trust of people to be able to admit that the other side had a point, whereas most lawyers would want to hide the evidence that hurt their cause. Leonard Swett said that if you thought Lincoln was as harmless as a dove, you would find that he was actually as shrewd as a serpent. And if you weren't careful, you'd find yourself laid up in a ditch.
As he grew as an attorney, he became what was known as a lawyer's lawyer. So if there was a case before the Illinois Supreme Court and an attorney lived in Galena, well, they don't want to make the 3 or 4 day journey to Springfield, so they would hire Lincoln to handle their case for him.
As Lincoln grew, so did the circuit. So the caseload became more diverse and more significant. The big change was railroads.
He was being brought in on really high-profile cases. One of the biggest questions was this railroad taxation case, and because of Lincoln's argument in that case, it kept the Illinois Central Railroad from going bankrupt.
And by the time Lincoln runs for the presidency, Lincoln had something like 300 cases that he argued before the Illinois Supreme Court. So you had to be a pretty outstanding lawyer to take a case all the way up to the Supreme Court level.
I would just love to see Lincoln coming into town. I would love to see this gigantic guy, 6'4", with a 1-foot stovepipe hat, right? He's over 7 feet. I would just like to see the presence. Did people turn? Did people look and think, this is an unusual looking fellow? What does the future hold? I would just love to have been witness to one of those entrances into a small town, because it must have been startling. The one thing we should never forget about Lincoln is not only was he a good lawyer, not only was he tireless on the circuit, but he was an amazing presence. He was a giant in an era when there were no giants, and it must have been a spectacular recollection for people.